You talked about the global stage, and you've been there yourself as an African youth leader. One of the perspectives I have is that Africa is not being listened to in many of these global conferences. That I sense that Africa is not taken as part of the solution to many of the global discussions on climate change and sustainable development goals. I sense that the rest of the world thinks that all Africa needs is help. From the conferences, from the interaction you have, do you think that the African voice, the African perspective cuts through, that our representatives in these negotiations are given an opportunity, or they are demanding the right things and actions, and we are visible in some of the needs and requirements we do? What has been your experience?
My experience is that the world has still not seen Africa as the solution it is to addressing the environmental and climate change challenge that we are in right now. And this is a big problem because with that, we are not going to be addressing climate change or even the ecological crisis. Right now, Africa is the most impacted by climate change, despite having contributed the least. And also Africa is the same continent that has most of its natural resources still intact. But then even those resources are still being impacted, they're still being degraded. They're still the foreign direct investments that's still impacting on these natural resources. And what is happening is that there are things that we've been trying to push for Africa, and one of them is to recognize the losses and the damages that have happened as a result of this crisis. And this is a continent that has least contributed to the crisis, a continent that also has the least capacity to adapt in terms of resources. And like what happened at the COP26, we were trying to push for the challenge of climate financing. This is a finance that was promised back in 2009. And this was 100 billion shillings promised by rich countries to be able to support countries like in Africa to adapt to the climate crisis. But then when you go to these conferences, it's all fake promises every other time, because that fund was supposed to be, the pledge was supposed to be fulfilled by 2020, but it did not happen. And then at the COP, we are being asked to wait until 2023 that it's going to happen. So we ask ourselves, if these promises have been done before and you fail to deliver, what makes us have trust that you will do it this time round? And this is all happening because the world has failed to recognize that Africa is not waiting for climate change to affect Africa in the future or next year. It's happening right now. And I think one of the things that I really struggled with is to find words that would move the leaders when I was speaking at the World Leaders Summit, to find words that would make these people understand that it's not happening tomorrow. We are sitting in the conference, but there are people back at home who are dying from this crisis, who are being impacted. But they are not just suffering, but they're also trying to find solutions every day to be able to deal with the crisis. And these initiatives and these solutions need to be supported to scale up so that they can also be able to deal with the crisis. So that's one thing that the world has still not realized. But again, all thanks to the many young African activists as well who are really rising up to the challenge and demanding for this action. And we saw so many in Glasgow as well, demanding for issues like a separate fund for loss and damage, and trying to push the leaders from the rich countries to also step up and do what they're supposed to do to cut emissions. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about the money. We also need to tackle the problem. The rich countries need to bring down their emissions, and also African countries need to be in a position where they can be able to deal with the crisis, to be able to deal with climate change at the moment. But this is not going to happen if Africa's money is being used to address climate change issues. So how are we going to get to a point where we can say that Africa is, away from poverty, or Africa has been able to support its people, yet Africa's money is going to address a problem that Africa did not even create? So that's why the whole challenge of climate finance, and I think this is a gap that the world still doesn't understand. But I think right now things are beginning to change, because at COP26, for the first time, we had the mention of the loss and damage finance. But again, that was not a win, because mentioning loss and damage and not providing the finance is still it's still not a win, because it's only one country, Scotland, that pledged to give money for loss and damage. But where are all the other countries that are responsible for historical emissions? So there's a whole problem of the world not seeing Africa as a solution to climate change.
Which is shocking, because you read the world, the rest of the world. UK just said, I think it was by 2035, they will have hybrid cars, and they're not going to be driving diesel engines, and all that depends so much on what Democratic Republic of Congo, what materials, lithium, and they're going to be providing to those who are manufacturing batteries. So which means that Congo, DRC, is responsible for the clean energy Europeans and North Americans are talking about. And so it's a part of the solution. There can be a win-win negotiation in that kind of regard. You see the Congo Basin forest that consumes a lot of the carbon more than any other country's forest, including Brazil, is not seen as part of the solution to what's going on in Europe. But I want to also to refer to what we heard you say at COP26. You spoke about words of empty promises, symbolic pledges and commitments that will not secure the livelihoods and well-being of children and young people. What would you think or say to African leaders to do differently as we prepare for COP27? It's going to be in Egypt, our backyard. The preparatory meeting is going to be in DRC. That's where really the agenda is formed and commitments are made before Egypt. What do you think we need to do now in preparing for that? Because sometimes we go to these conferences when it's too late for us to really mobilize ourselves. What would be your advice?
So one of the things that came out of the Glasgow package was the fact that leaders would come back every year with new revised ambitions, demonstrating how they're helping us tackle the climate crisis. But again, we cannot sit back and wait until next year for leaders to come back and try to get it right again, because climate change impacts are still impacting people right now. And I think for us right now to do it differently in Egypt, it has to begin right now. We cannot wait until the COP to go and begin making new pledges and commitments, because these pledges and commitments are not helping anybody. If anything, they are only delaying action. And if anything, the more we delay action, the more losses and damage we are facing as a result of climate change. So what we need to do right now is that countries need to get back down to the ground. And this is going to really be influenced also by civil society and young people. There was a whole movement of civil society and young people at the COP26 pushing for a more ambitious outcome, pushing for a great outcome at the COP. And that was out of the blue zone. People were demonstrating, thousands of people getting the leaders to give us the outcome that we came to get at Glasgow, in Glasgow at COP26. But I think, if anything, we have been waiting for so long and talking, making pledges, commitments, trying to appear as though we are addressing climate change. And then when we get to the COP, there's literally nothing that's happening on the ground. We are just making commitments to look good. And I think what's supposed to look different right now is that we need countries to actually demonstrate what they have done in the past year, while in Egypt, to be able to get us to tackle the climate crisis. And it doesn't help in any way if leaders spend the whole of the COP demonstrating how they see gaps in emission reductions, how they see the gaps in finance, how they see the gaps in loss and damage, but none of them wills to step up to fill those gaps. So I think this is the time to fill all those gaps that we were recognizing existing in Glasgow. And then in Egypt, if anything, we should not spend that time on more pledges and commitments when we've not even fulfilled what we've committed to do in the past. And I think the next COP as well has to really be inclusive, especially for the young people and the civil society and the indigenous communities, because these are the voices that were often being left on the sidelines, even at COP26. Voices whereby you're still given the chances to express yourselves or share ideas, but then we do not see these things that we are saying being implemented in the decision making. We want to see an outcome that reflects what the civil society are saying. We want to see an outcome that reflects the young people and the indigenous communities as well. It has to be an inclusive outcome, and that's the only time we will say that we are being listened to. Because if you present proposals like young people, for example, of how you want things to change, and then an outcome comes in that does not reflect any of what you said, then it means that nobody's listening. And that's how Egypt can be different, but it has to be inclusive, and we have to begin right now. Countries have ambitions that they need to work on right now to address climate change. And if we just sit back and wait for Egypt doing nothing between now and Egypt, then I think we will still be moving many steps backwards.
I feel a sense, from what you're saying, that the current structure, the idea that governments are representing people in these kind of negotiations, really doesn't make the mark, because the voices of the people, those are demonstrating, those civil society is what they're saying, is not the voice we hear you are saying in governments when they're representing us. And therefore, there's a need to create space for civil societies and the public to be able to participate in this kind of negotiation, that the idea that governments represent us in these kind of things might not be working very well. But I want you to talk a little bit more about an NGO like ours. I lead the largest oldest African conservation organization. We are working in many countries on this continent, advising governments on the future of conservation. What do you think we can do better to give voice to the young people, especially around the climate action? That is really the biggest challenge you said you have as the continental youth?
I would say one of the best ways to support young people right now is to first understand what it is that it means to meaningfully and genuinely engage young people. Because I know there's a lot of organizations that label as though they are supporting young people, but at the end of the day, it ends up to be tokenistic, and tokenistic in a way that young people need to be supported on a long-term basis, that they are having solutions. And sometimes we see them, they get to places and they exhibit what they're trying to work on, the initiatives, but it ends at that. Nobody reaches out back to them. They're brought into events. There is like a 1 day or 2 day event, pictures are taken, it's posted, but at the end of the day, what these young people brought, it's probably not implemented into the longer term programs for the organizations, or at the end of the day, their initiatives, they're still struggling to scale them up, or even they're still struggling to do much more in terms of conservation. So I think the best thing right now is to make sure that young people are genuinely and fully engaged in terms of not just giving them a voice or amplifying their work, but also making sure that their solutions can be able to access funding, and also that their solutions can be able to be implemented elsewhere. Because there's so many great initiatives right now that young people are working on. And when we talk about climate change, we are not inventing anything new. All the things and solutions we are putting at the table, there are people on the ground working on them. But if we can imagine how much we will achieve if all these solutions are scaled up, then we can be able to bridge a huge gap, because we're saying that the big corporations and governments are not stepping up, but there are people on the ground, they're struggling to lift themselves up, they're struggling to work on their solutions, but they are working on the real-time solutions. These are people who are driven by passion, and they're not doing it to get paid or get any visibility, but they're doing it because they've identified challenges in their communities and they want to support their people. So that would be one of the best ways to support young people, and also make sure that the young people also have enough and equal access to education and capacity building, because we cannot assume that all of our young people in Africa or here in Kenya understand about environment and climate issues. There's need to scale up the education and capacity building to get all of them to understand that we are in a crisis, and that the decisions being made today will impact them in the future, and so they have to be involved. They have to be interested in these in the environment and in climate change issues. But we cannot assume that they all know. So it has to be a program that is actually long-term, that is bringing every young person on board, and also recognizing that young people are faced with other challenges. There's a challenge of unemployment. So many young people are faced with the challenge of including the mental health issues right now. And this is all doubled up with the day-to-day life challenges. And without addressing all of these challenges together, then it's going to be difficult to say that we are involving and helping young people. But I think what young people need now more than ever as well is to get the economic and also the political system to work not against them, but together with them. And I'll give a good example. There are big corporations and businesses right now, maybe in Africa, around the world, that would appear as though they are addressing climate change issues. But at the end of the day, they are also behind the scenes, corporations that are, for example, either fueling nature degradation or deforestation, but also, they will come and say, we are planting trees, but on the other hand, they will not stop the activities that are still fueling degradation and nature destruction. So I think what we need to happen is that in addition to supporting the young people need to feel as though we are all collaborating, like everybody is working towards a similar goal, and not having young people working on solutions, but on the other hand, there are people that are undermining the efforts of young people by putting us steps backwards into addressing climate change and environmental related issues. So it's more of supporting the individual responsibility fully, and also making sure that as companies and as organizations, we are also doing the best that we can to give these young people a livable world and a safe future through our actions.
Yes, indeed, and I like the idea of of the emphasis on support, because it's so easy for NGO like us or some international NGOs, which is very, very common. People who are with goodwill, good intentions, they jump in to help instead of to support. You are rightly saying these things are being done. There are people on the ground doing these things. There are good ideas here. All they need is support, not help. Don't come and form another NGO. Don't mobilize resources for another international NGO when the need is here. And the idea of this is a political, this is social, and economic angle to everything conservation. It's part of everything. And for people who are 70% of this continent, it's challenging to understand why the politics doesn't work for them. They are the biggest voting bloc for any government in Africa, the young people. Whether it's a military, they are the majority in the military. They are the majority in the police. They are the majority in the public arena when it comes to voting or changing systems. But the system is not working for them. So there's a little bit of awareness, I think you touched on, that there's a need to raise awareness. And the work is cut for us, me and you and others who are involved in this. Can you share, we are in December, mid-December. Can you share with us some of the things you are looking forward to next year, 2022? 3 things you are really going to be engaged in, or worrying you, or support you need to move some needles in the coming year.
And thank you for asking for 3 things, because it's actually 3 things that I'm focusing on in the next year. And one of them, and it's so much linked to COP26 and the message that I was putting forward in COP26, asking people and the leaders to open their hearts. And one of my focus for the next year is going to be around humanizing the climate crisis. And what this means is that people out there do not understand the scale with which climate change is impacting our people, for example, here in Kenya. And by really showing the world what is happening, and not just for the challenges, but also the solutions that people are working on, then it changes the narrative from just the data and statistics, but also bringing it to the ground and showing people the real picture of what we mean by saying that we are being impacted by climate change, and what we mean by saying that we are not just sitting back and being victims. We are stepping up and working on solutions, and these are the solutions. So there's going to be a lot of focus on making sure that I also use my platforms to give voices to people who are being impacted by climate change. And these are places where we are seeing in the news people being affected by climate change, but also they're doing something to address the crisis. So that's going to be one of the ways to continue amplifying and letting the world know what is happening on the ground in terms of climate change challenges, and just painting the real picture of how things are. And the other thing, I'm going to also focus a lot on the ecosystem and nature-based restoration. And this is going to be through Green Generation Initiative, because one of my greatest vision right now and focus is to scale up the initiative. And I had a wider vision of making sure that this initiative cuts across all the 47 regions in Kenya right now, because I've seen what it's been able to do with a few young people and children that we've been able to reach so far. And so thinking around how we can be able to reach all the 47 regions in Kenya. And one of the greatest, I would say, project we are doing right now is we're calling it a green school model, where we are picking part in the school compound and establishing a structure that contains both a green fence, a food forest, a kitchen garden, a small park where the kids can be able to study under, and also we are also focusing on a waste management corner, but all in one structure. So we are calling it like a green school model. And we've been able to do one in one of the schools in Nairobi, in Kiambu actually. And it's really doing well, and seeing the fact that the school that we have done this, they only had one tree when we went in. And it's the same with so many other schools. The public schools especially, you find that the kids don't even have grass to sit under. They can only sit on the soil, and there are no trees to find shade, so they only sit in class when they are eating their meals. And also looking at food security right now, it's a big challenge. So if we continue to do the food forest, then we can be able to feed a bigger population of young people in the next coming years, and also educate them on climate change. So that's one of my greatest focus in scaling up Green Generation Initiative, and of course extending wider to working with communities, including indigenous communities, because we understand that right now people need an immediate response to climate change, because they're not waiting for the challenges to happen tomorrow. They're facing them right now. So working on this initiative to, number one, nurture the young people, but also there's that immediate response. And I've just mentioned about humanizing the climate crisis. It's also going to be through the initiative. And lastly, also through my activism, I'm really focusing on pushing the Glasgow package outcome that was for leaders to come back next year to report on how they're report on their ambitions, revise their ambitions, and also report on how they're helping us keep 1.5 alive. And this is not going to happen if there's no pressure. So part of the work next year is to keep up the pressure, to make sure that every country actually fulfills the pledges and commitments they made in Glasgow and even before Glasgow. And
finally, you are motivated, you are ambitious, you know what you are doing. You have that network. Are you optimistic that things are going to get better? That the world is moving the right direction?
Well, I would say of course, I'm outraged on one hand. So many young people are outraged because things are not moving yet. These are not where we expect them to be. But through our collective action and through the pressure that we are putting up and through every activity we are doing right now, I do believe that things are going to get better, but they are not going to get any better without our pressure, because that's how it looks like. It's been years of activism, and we still get disappointed, we still get the empty promises, but I think this power and the real change is going to come from the people themselves who understand about these challenges, people who resonate well with us, and people who understand the injustices and also the injustices that have come as a result of climate change. So there is a whole mass movement of people right now who are working towards that, and just knowing that I am not alone in this fight. There's so many other young people, there's so many other people even in your generation who are actually supporting young people in this movement, and also so many other organizations that are working to make sure that we get there. So yes, I am optimistic that we will get there, but only with our pressure.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and good luck with the 2022 agenda, and looking forward to meeting you and working with you in the future. And thank you for those our audience for tuning in. See you next time.